Welcome to CS1203 Database Systems 1. This is the Unit 3 lecture part 2. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about conceptual modeling. Now, for those of you that have already had an opportunity to go through and read this week's reading assignment for Unit 3, one of the things you're going to probably notice in the chapter is the fact that there's not a lot of new information. Primarily what we're going to be dealing with in this process of conceptual modeling is taking all the elements that we've been learning about to date and pulling them together. And when I say pulling them together, what I really am referring to is the core role of what we're trying to accomplish with conceptual modeling, which is to solve a particular business problem. Now, if we think back to the series of assignments that we are having in this course, you'll probably recall the fact that we are actually going through the process of trying to understand the data requirements of a library system. So in previous assignments, we've had to identify the relations and perhaps the attributes. We've looked at constraints and we've looked at defining what the keys are. And you'll notice that all of these items kind of come up in the process of conceptual modeling, but kind of what we're doing in the conceptual modeling process is trying to pull all these elements together to solve a particular problem. Now, in the case of a library system, the problem that we're trying to solve is that we're trying to keep track of everything that goes on in the operation of the library. So we have to have entities or relations that are going to keep track of information such as what books do we have and which books are checked out and to whom are they checked out and who are those borrowers of the book and who are the librarians that assist the people that come to the library. So all of those are pieces of information that are necessary to solve the business problem or the organizational problem of running the library. And part of what we want to look at in this process of conceptual modeling is how do we do that? So we're going to look at some of the steps that have been outlined in our text around conceptual modeling. Now the first one is that we're going to look at, and I'm not going to go there. I'm actually going to start with a step 0, which really doesn't exist in our text, and I'm going to define step 0 as kind of a thinking process. So when we first start trying to develop our conceptual model, the first thing we want to do is think a little bit about what it is we're trying to accomplish and what the problem is that we're trying to solve. So in the case of the library system, what we're going to do is we have to sit down and think about what are all the kinds of information that we need to keep. What are those nouns and objects that are going to represent the relations that we have to identify. So kind of the step 0 of this process, if you would, is really around thinking. And that thinking process is really about trying to figure out and determine what all the information needs are, and those information needs that we would have to solve the particular business problem. Now, getting into what we have in the text, there's kind of a step 1, and step 1 is to say, now that we kind of have an understanding of what those entities are, and perhaps even given some thought around what the relationships and constraints, etc. are, we need to have a way of documenting that. So up to this point in the course, we've spent a lot of time defining relations, we've identified keys, we've come up with what some constraints are, we have determined what some of the relationships are between those in the context of defining primary keys and foreign keys, and how those entities or relations relate to each other. So kind of the next step is to pull this all together and develop an entity relationship diagram. Now we're going to look at this idea of an entity relationship, or as we sometimes shorten it to ER diagram, a little bit later in the course, actually in the third lecture of this unit. But let's just suffice it to say this is kind of the second step of the process, to sit down and build out that entity relationship diagram. And what we're going to wind up doing there is we're going to draw entities, attributes, and we're going to draw arrows with little crow's feet on them between those entities. And by the way, when I say the word entity, you can kind of substitute it right now for the word relation, because essentially they are very, the same type of element. So everywhere we have a relation in the entity relationship diagram, that relation will become an entity. So once I've written up or drawn up my entity relationship diagram, then I'm going to go through the next step of the problem, which is to kind of identify and define the constraints. And you kind of recall back to when we did a lot of the work with constraints in the second unit, because the idea is that we have to make sure that the integrity of the data is maintained, and we can use things such as constraints to do that. So I'm going to go through a process. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to determine what all the relationships are, or the relations are, the attributes that I'm going to require, the relationships that exist between those attributes. I'm going to take all of that information. I'm going to write it up in the context of an entity relationship diagram, and then I'm going to define the constraints. And then the third thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to go back and review the model that I've created to determine if I've got any errors, if I'm omitted anything, I have anything missing in it, and then kind of go back and correct it. So a lot of times this process of defining a conceptual model is really about an iterative process of thinking, drawing it up, defining the constraints, reviewing it to see if there are some problems or errors or issues in the model that I've created, and then kind of going back and thinking some more about it, making adjustments to the diagram, defining, if necessary, new constraints, and so on and so forth until I have a really good and valid model. It's important to get this part right. And you're going to hear about this in other courses, particularly when you start getting into our software engineering course, because this is kind of the process of requirements definition. You absolutely, positively want to make sure that you have the very best possible set of requirements before you actually start building something. Because it's relatively easy to change things at this stage in the game, but when you're several months into the project, or you've already done a lot of work to go out and implement some of these concepts in a relational database system, at that point in time it becomes a lot more complex and a lot more difficult to go back and make corrections. So these are kind of the steps of developing our conceptual model, and let's just kind of put that right up at the top. And we basically got 4 steps in here. Now, again, I'm going to emphasize the most important element of this, and our text is going to kind of lead you through a whole process, and it's going to introduce a lot of the things that we need to consider as we go through and do this. But I really wanted to stress the idea that this is really about a requirements definition process, that it's very important to get it right. And the reason why is because it's a lot easier to change things at this stage of the game than it would be at a point down the road.